Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. This is a show I take a look at every classic Doctor Who story, one episode a day, 7 days a week, plus a bunch of Big Finish dramas. And today, on the 23rd of March, 2019, we are starting a look at the second televised story of Season 15, The Invisible Enemy. Now, I'd like to apologize for the lateness of this video. Sadly, we're entering a time where life starts to get crazy. So it's really we're going to be trying to get videos out on time, but we're probably going to be missing more and more. I do apologize for this. I'm trying to keep a good pace, but that being said, Invisible Enemy Part 1 is a promising start to the story. Now, a lot of this idea is simple. There's a base on Titan, a relief crew coming to the base, and the relief crew is essentially attacked and taken over by an alien entity. Now, this alien entity is known as the Swarm. It's the titular invisible enemy. It's a microscopic organism that essentially is taking over the life forms, on the ship, and some really gruesome imagery. Like, they then gun down all their comrades basically cause a mayday. Now, that is something that is really, that is really, really intense, actually. And it's actually really well done, especially for a Doctor Who story in the 1970s. And you have, of course, the Doctor and Leela come to help, but what's interesting, Leela, using her sort of savage instincts, kind of can tell that something's up. She sort of senses the swarm, which is a little weird, but I'll at least buy it for the sake of this story, because it does kind of work that Leela sort of understands that something's wrong. She understands. She notices because she notices when on the TARDIS console the Doctor gets possessed by the swarm somehow. And a lot of this episode is really going to be pitting Leela against the Doctor, because the Doctor has been taken over. The contact has been made, which is honestly a really creepy sort of voice. Voice provided by John Leeson, who is playing two roles in the story: the Swarm and a character who we'll get to a little later, but you all, let's be honest, you all probably know who he is, but I'll keep it a mystery because he doesn't appear in this episode. And what's amazing is that, the episode ends with the Doctor taking up a gun to shoot Leela. A lot of this episode is really, really intense and really, really dark. Now, I do, however, have a couple of problems. Mainly, the Star Wars influences on this episode, start to show. Now, this is, Star Wars was released in 1977, and this story came out in late 1977. And we're entering a period of the show where Star Wars really starts to influence it quite a bit, like it influences a lot of science fiction. And unlike Star Wars, the model shots in this haven't actually aged well. And oddly enough, they don't even look that good for the time. They have, the sort of all of the complete white of the corridors and things, overacting, the sort of white spacesuits sort of almost emulate the stormtroopers. It's taking influences, and you can really see where the influences work. And honestly, if the production design decided perhaps was a little more creative and maybe dimmed the lights occasionally, the influence would be a really nice kind of homage to bits of Star Wars. But as it is, it's just sort of a pale imitation in places, and it's something that we're actually going to be coming back to in the next couple of seasons, because again, the Star Wars influence is never really stop. But I also even argue that just the direction of this episode is kind of weak. It's a new director. I believe it's George Spenton Foster, I think, or I could be completely wrong on that. But the director, he doesn't have much flair. He does just a lot of shot, reverse shot, maybe a close up here and there, which coming right off of, visually right off of something like Horror of Fang Rock, which kept things tight, and kept kept a lot of the shot and focus on looking at our characters, being a story where we have to do things. Derek Goodwin, who directed this, this is like the only. I think this may be one of like maybe 2 stories he directed. He doesn't quite know what he's doing. I believe it's possible that like this is the only episode he actually directed. So you have this sad feeling that it's something that you really sort of possibly need a bit more experience to do a story like this, at least this first episode. But than that, there are a couple of interesting things to note. Mainly that one, we get back to the original TARDIS console room here after the secondary console room in the last season, in a new set. In this set, the room itself is going to be the room that we get till the end of the classic series. So enjoy it, and it's a slightly bigger room than the previous, than the previous time we saw it in season way back in season 13. The console is slightly bigger now and slightly harder to do, but it's nice. We have the columns. It's a really good set, even if the direction in it isn't the best. It's this is just one of those. It's just an episode that's pretty good. It just kind of needs to it maybe needed a little bit more dimming of the lights, and honestly, the music score isn't helping it. Dudley Simpson isn't. He really doesn't help the tension at all with the music. It's almost like he's phoning it in, which honestly, because it was one of the big problems that Simpson has in this period. It takes a while for him to improve and give us some really interesting scores again, because he basically becomes the composer for the next. He continues composing for the next 3 seasons of the show, and honestly, the music is kind of bland. When a lot of the music could have helped make some of the tense moments feel more tense, and just sort of give us a better sense of danger and things. But that being said, The Invisible Enemy Part 1 is a good start. We have an intriguing story, an intriguing villain, potentially, and we have the Doctor versus his companion, something that could be interesting to follow for a story. So I'm going to give The Invisible Enemy Part 1 a 7 out of 10. All right, it is the 25th, the 25th of March 2019, and I just finished watching Part 2 of The Invisible Enemy. Part 2 of The Invisible Enemy isn't as good as Part 1. We've taken a shift down in quality, but it at least does some interesting things. One, Bob Baker and Dave Martin, who are writing the script, they decided that they're not going to quite do as much of the Doctor versus companion thing that Part 1 kind of set up, which perhaps would be a bit more interesting than a more standard story. Basically, this story immediately transitions us into the hospital. The man that Leela, his name was Lowe? It was either Lowe or Servant. I don't remember which one. It's difficult. He's played, I think, by Michael Sheard. Basically, they get him to a hospital on Jupiter's moon Titan, where there is a Professor Marius, and a lot of the episodes just is the swarm sort of building its numbers, which is interesting. But actually, other than that, there isn't too much plot. Like, a lot of it's just the Doctor and Professor Marius basically talking about what the villain is and some maybe potential ways that they could defeat it. But there isn't actually any, concrete movement until the very end where it's like, well, we'll just make a clone of the Doctor and Leela and inject them in because Leela's immune for whatever reason. Again, the idea is like, it's her intelligence, sort of, but that doesn't really get explained. It's just sort of like, yeah, she's primitive, so she is immune to this random disease. It's just it just doesn't make much sense, and it doesn't get much of an explanation. I also really like the makeup. I do like the makeup job done on the eyes and the hands. Like, by the end, the Doctor's, like, fully covered in this fur, because, like, he usually goes into a coma, and it's basically, the implication is that there's a battle of wits between the Doctor and this enemy, which I think maybe if we heard stuff from the Doctor's perspective a bit more, and the swarm inside of him, we could be a little more interesting, because as it happens, there isn't actually much of the fighting going on. Like, the swarm ends up sabotaging bits of this hospital for reasons, for just a random, I guess it's just sort of a random, we need some action in this second episode, that doesn't really go anywhere. I think a lot of it seems to be because it's like, hey, we're introducing K9. Yeah, this is the story where we introduce the character of K9, as voiced by John Leeson, who obviously everyone knows he becomes a companion, but that wasn't known at the time. K9, he's an interesting character here. He doesn't quite have a rapport with the Doctor or Leela yet, as he'll get later on, as the relationship develops, because obviously the script was written that he wasn't going to become a companion. So he's obviously, initially, he's wary of Leela, so much so that he's going to shoot her because she has a knife. It's a nice little touch that, K9, he of course he wouldn't trust this person. His master is Professor Marius, and obviously not Leela yet. Now so he still has a little bit of a growth to do. This is really, K9 is really the first influence we really get that this is a new producer. This is Graham Williams. This is something that wouldn't have happened under Philip Hinchcliffe. Yes, Robert Holmes is still technically script editor. Anthony Reed doesn't take over until later in the season. But this is still very much something that is not one of Robert Holmes' ideas. It's it's someone else's idea. It's a different, it's sort of a different idea. And John Leeson, he's good. Professor Marius is also an interesting character, played by Frederick Gager. He's sort of larger than life and fun. But honestly, a lot of the middle of this episode, even though the action is exciting, it's decently directed action. And the sets of the hospital are a little better than the space station, but they still look pretty cheap. And honestly, this is what people mean by wobbly sets. A lot of the episode almost just seems like part 2 was kind of unnecessary. It's got some good moments, but a lot of it just doesn't really, progress the story. It progresses the story just to a little point, and the cliffhanger ending is the clone of the Doctor and Leela swirling into the Doctor's ear, which it feels more like a stopping moment than a cliffhanger we're in danger moment, because one, we should worry that the Doctor and Leela's clones can't save the Doctor, but also they're clones. We could technically try it again, maybe. I mean, because the Doctor is still passed out. There really isn't just much tension in the end of the episode that there really needed to be if you wanted the story to work better. So it's just, it doesn't, again, it can't work like that. So that being said, I'm going to give The Invisible Enemy Part 2 a 5 out of 10. It is the 26th of March, 2019, and I just finished watching Part 3 of The Invisible Enemy. Now, Part 3 of The Invisible Enemy is the weakest episode thus far. This story so far, Parts 2 and 3 feel like they were supposed to be one part, and then that one episode was stretched out to 2, which seems to be an issue Doctor Who has had in the past, but this one is especially severe, because a lot of it is the swarm breaks into the room, takes over Marius, and tries to get the Doctor's clone out of his body, while the Doctor and Leela clone basically defeat the swarm. Like, the swarm exits the body of the Doctor, and it gets out through the tear duct. What's interesting is that they actually, they try to retrieve the clones, which is, it's a weird thing, because the idea is that the clones are gonna die anyway, so was there really a point in, having to retrieve them? couldn't you just sort of let them die, and not have to worry about it? Or no, this was part of a plan, and uh, they need, and they need to get them out. It's not really explained very well. It's not explained at all. It's it's a very odd sort of thing for the story to do, by giving, basically being like, all right, this is how the clones are gonna survive, even though it's not really how not really how the story is meant to be done. It's just sort of like, oh, we are doing it like this, and we're not going to stop it. We're just gonna be like, we're just gonna have the story work out so that that they get out. And a lot of the exploration bits in the mind of the Doctor, they have some decent sets, but they're really dull. Like, so much so that they end with nothing really. They end, and you don't. It doesn't. It feels like nothing's really been. Nothing has been. Nothing's really been resolved. It's just like, oh, we've got them out now. The Doctor's free from the nucleus, but now everyone else has it. Also, there's this weird bit, like just an odd bit in general where K9 gets taken over by the nucleus. So it's like, yeah, now K9's evil, then resets so it doesn't work, but it doesn't stick because it's because I guess the idea is it's because the character it's not an organic machine. This is an episode where there really isn't that big and that nice of a conclusion. It's like, okay, we kind of did this, so story that doesn't really make a lot of sense. The episode doesn't give us much of a conclusion. Also, the big cliffhanger moment is, well, it's this weird bit where it's like, oh, the swarm makes it out alive. Apparently that's, I mean, yeah, I guess it's a bad thing now that the titular invisible enemy is visible, but really, is that worrying? Because now that it's visible, does that mean, is there really a danger, or will everything be okay because of this? It doesn't make too much sense. It's it's one of those sort of interesting little it's one of those interesting little sort of, we did this idea, but we didn't really, they didn't really think it through all that much. Like, it just doesn't do much. There's also this weird conversation the Doctor has with the nucleus of the swarm, basically talking to it, as if it um, you know, as if they are equals, which is just it's really weird. Um, it's one of those weird little things where it's like, yeah, we did this, or we don't know why we did this, but they did it for whatever reason, and it doesn't come across very well. Um, it ends rather abruptly, um, and really could have been sort of integrated a lot better in the script, um, and given a bit more information, just maybe a bit more exploration. Like, a lot of this story really needed. So I'm going to give the Invisible Enemy Part 3 a 3 out of 10 because it's not good. It is the 27th of March 2019, and I just finished watching Part 4 of The Invisible Enemy, which, well, it's weak. This entire story has just sort of built on the fact that this is a weak entry into the series. By the end of it, honestly, the episode maybe could have been 10 minutes long, and we would have had about as much emotional investment as, every other story. It's one of those stories where it's an episode where, we started out pretty good, and, the villain in the swarm really could have been something special. But really, as it is, the storm doesn't do much. Like, the taking over of Marius, that gets reversed almost immediately. And the Doctor has a plan to defeat, has a plan to defeat the swarm immediately. Like, he figures out the immunity, and after that's done, there are no real, there's no real sort of story there. It's just sort of, we did this. We did this story, and we didn't really put any quote unquote weight behind it when it comes to what the plot is. It's it's just sort of a story where it's an episode that's, hey, we exist. It's like the actual swarm that we see is complete. It's sort of just this complete cheap thing. It looks all plasticky and vinyl-y, like it probably needed a little. It needed a little more for. It needed a little more for the story to really work well. As a story, it's it's just like we have this idea, so we're not even really going to do anything interesting with it. We're just like, it exists. It's not really doing anything too special with it. It's just like, we exist. So, yeah, try to enjoy it. It's not a solid ending. So overall, I'm going to give Invisible Enemy Part 4 a 2 out of 10, because the nicest thing is K9 leaves with them. That's about it. So yeah, 2 out of 10. And we average it out to give The Invisible Enemy a final score of 4.25 out of 10. Thank you for watching this installment of the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. And join me next time when we continue the Season 15 of Classic Doctor Who with Image of the FENDAHL.